The Rockefeller dynasty transformed modern medicine, using philanthropy as a masterstroke of control. From the Flexner Report to a pharmaceutical-driven healthcare system, their calculated moves shaped public health. This wasn't just philanthropy, it was strategy. Are you ready to uncover the truths that have been hidden for generations? This is the story of "He who pays the piper calls the tune." Chapter 1. The Network. The words echoed through the marble corridors of the Rockefeller Institute, where the grand ambition of reshaping medical education in America had been born. It wasn't just about improving standards. It was about control over education, medicine, and ultimately society itself. This wasn't philanthropy. It was strategy. Fred Gates, a former preacher turned financial visionary, sat in a polished leather chair in John D. Rockefeller's opulent office. Rockefeller's empire wasn't just oil, it was influence, and Gates was his instrument.
Fred, what we need is efficiency, the kind of efficiency that shapes the minds of a nation. We're not just funding education, we're investing in the future, but not just any future, our future.
Gates nodded. He had a plan. The Rockefeller Foundation would pour millions into medical schools across the country, but not without conditions. The schools that accepted the money would adopt curricula steeped in pharmacology and laboratory research, natural medicine, holistic approaches, and nutrition. Those would be relegated to the dustbin of history. Behind closed doors, Rockefeller and his advisors ensured that rigorous scientific criteria meant a focus on pharmaceutical research. Within a decade, the number of medical schools in America had been halved, and those that survived owed their existence to Rockefeller's largesse. The Flexner Report was their opening gambit. Published in 1910, it was a scathing critique of medical education in America. Abraham Flexner, an academic with ties to the Carnegie Foundation, had written it with Rockefeller's backing. The report exposed the inadequacies of medical schools, pointing to their lack of standardization and scientific rigor. But it also set the stage for a seismic shift, one that would align medical education with the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. Flexner's recommendations were clear: close the substandard schools and fund only those that met rigorous scientific criteria. Behind closed doors, Rockefeller and his advisors ensured that rigorous scientific criteria meant a focus on pharmaceutical research. Within a decade, the number of medical schools in America had been halved, and those that survived owed their existence to Rockefeller's largesse. At Yale, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Chicago, grants poured in, but the money came with strings attached. Rockefeller's representatives sat on the boards, shaping policy and curriculum. The school's dependence on external funding made them compliant, willing to toe the line. And then there was the American Medical Association. Once a fragmented group of physicians with little centralized authority, the AMA had been transformed by Rockefeller's funding. It now wielded enormous power over accreditation and licensure, enforcing standards that aligned perfectly with Rockefeller's vision. It wasn't just about medicine, it was about molding society. Rockefeller's influence extended beyond education. He supported research institutions, think tanks, and media outlets, ensuring that the narrative always served his agenda. The average citizen, unaware of the intricate web of influence, trusted their doctors and educators, never suspecting that their choices had been shaped by unseen hands. Gates knew the stakes were high. Rockefeller's rivals were watching, waiting for an opportunity to undermine him. But Gates also knew that they had a secret weapon: patience. They didn't need to force their agenda overnight. The seeds they planted in medical schools and research institutions would bear fruit for generations. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Medical education was now firmly in the grip of the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Doctors were trained to prescribe drugs, not to explore alternatives. Nutrition was dismissed as irrelevant, and the public, inundated with advertising and endorsements, came to see synthetic drugs as the pinnacle of modern medicine. In a quiet moment, Gates reflected on the irony. Rockefeller, the man whose father had sold dubious elixirs as Dr. William Rockefeller in the 19th century, had now legitimized the pharmaceutical industry on an unprecedented scale. The quackery of the past had been replaced with the scientific veneer of the present, but at its core it was still about one thing: profit. As Gates left Rockefeller's office, he knew they were just getting started. The General Education Board, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the countless institutions they funded were more than philanthropic endeavors. They were levers of power, and Gates was the man pulling the strings. The Flexner Report had been the opening move. Now, the real game was about to begin. Chapter 2. The charity prescription. Dr. William Welch, head of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, paced the room. The institute had just received another $2 million grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, ostensibly for research into infectious diseases. But Welch knew the real purpose. The money was a weapon, and he was its wielder.
We're shaping the future of medicine.
Welch said to his colleague, Simon Flexner.
But not everyone sees it that way. The critics keep harping on about nutrition and holistic care. They're stuck in the past.
Flexner nodded.
Let them talk. They'll be irrelevant soon enough. We control the schools, the research, and the narrative. The public trusts us. That's all that matters.
The AMA Journal was their primary vehicle for disseminating information. Funded in part by pharmaceutical companies, it touted the latest drugs and treatments while dismissing alternatives as quackery. The AMA Journal was their primary vehicle for disseminating information. Funded in part by pharmaceutical companies, it touted the latest drugs and treatments while dismissing alternatives as quackery. The AMA's Council on Drugs, heavily influenced by Rockefeller-backed scientists, ensured that only approved products made it to market. Behind the scenes, the pharmaceutical companies were thriving. Patent laws and FDA regulations, both shaped by Rockefeller's allies, created an environment where competition was minimal and profits were astronomical. The public, convinced by advertising and endorsements, had no idea they were pawns in a larger game. One of the most controversial moves came in the 1940s, when the Rockefeller Foundation funded a series of studies linking vitamins to health outcomes. At first glance, it seemed like a genuine effort to advance science. But the study's conclusions were carefully managed. They emphasized synthetic vitamins over natural sources, paving the way for pharmaceutical companies to dominate the market. Dr. Maurice Fishbein, the editor of the AMA Journal, was a staunch ally. Under his leadership, the journal became a mouthpiece for the pharmaceutical industry. Fishbein's critics accused him of suppressing alternative therapies, but he dismissed them as cranks.
We're not suppressing anything.
Fishbein insisted.
We're promoting science. If these so-called alternatives were effective, they'd stand up to scrutiny, but they don't.
Privately, Fishbein admitted that the AMA's reliance on pharmaceutical advertising created a conflict of interest, but he saw it as a necessary evil. Without funding, the AMA couldn't maintain its influence, and without influence, the medical establishment couldn't control the narrative. As the years passed, the divide between orthodox and alternative medicine grew wider. The Rockefellers had succeeded in creating a system where dissenting voices were marginalized, if not silenced outright. Doctors who questioned the pharmaceutical model risked losing their licenses. Researchers who pursued unorthodox studies found themselves cut off from funding. Yet, despite their success, Rockefeller and his allies knew the battle was far from over. Public skepticism was a constant threat. They needed to stay ahead, to keep shaping perceptions, to ensure that their vision of medicine remained dominant.
This is only the beginning. The world will remember us not for what we built, but for what we changed.
Rockefeller had once said, "The world will remember us not for what we built, but for what we changed." And change it they did. Chapter 3. The machinery of influence. By the late 1930s, the Rockefeller empire was no longer just an empire. It was the empire. Oil, education, medicine. They owned the chessboard, and they were moving the pieces. But there was one frontier left to conquer: public health. The Milbank Memorial Fund was their golden ticket. On the surface, it was everything America loved, noble, altruistic, a beacon of hope in a nation still finding its way after the Great Depression. Behind closed doors, it was something else entirely, a machine designed to shape government policy and steer the future of healthcare. John Kingsbury was the man with the plan. As the fund's executive director, he didn't just play the game, he wrote the rules. Kingsbury was a true believer in his mission: preventive medicine, public health, and most importantly, federal health insurance. He wanted a system that looked like compassion but worked like capitalism, ensuring the pharmaceutical and insurance industries stayed rich while the public thought it was all for their benefit.
The public needs a story,
Kingsbury said, leaning forward in a smoke-filled meeting room in New York. His piercing gaze scanned the small group of advisors around him.
Not just data, not just charts. Real human stories. A mother choosing between medicine for her kid and food on the table. A worker dying because he can't afford a doctor. We sell that story, and we win.
But Albert Milbank wasn't buying it. Milbank, the fund's president and its ultimate gatekeeper, was more than just a wealthy philanthropist. He was a businessman, a pragmatist who knew when to cut his losses. And Kingsbury? He was looking more and more like a liability.
John,
Milbank said one afternoon in his corner office, the Manhattan skyline a grey blur behind him.
we have a problem.
Kingsbury smirked. The kind of smirk that told you he thought he'd already won.
A problem? I think we're on the verge of a breakthrough. The studies are...
Milbank cut him off with a wave of his hand.
It's not the studies, it's you. Your health insurance crusade. It's ruffling feathers in places we can't afford to ruffle.
You mean the AMA?
Kingsbury shot back, his voice rising.
Those dinosaurs are terrified of progress. We're on the right side of history, Albert, and you know it.
Milbank's jaw tightened.
It's not just the AMA, it's Borden.
Borden? The milk company?
Yes, the milk company. The AMA is calling for a boycott of Borden's products because of you, because of the fund. You're putting my other interests at risk, and that's not something I can tolerate.
Kingsbury leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms.
So this isn't about health insurance, it's about money. Your money.
Milbank's eyes narrowed.
It's about survival, John. The fund has always been about science, objectivity, staying above the fray. You've turned it into a soapbox for your personal agenda. That ends now.
Kingsbury stood, his chair scraping against the floor.
You're making a mistake, Albert. The public needs this. The country needs this.
And the fund needs to stay alive. You've left us no choice. Your resignation is effective immediately.
For a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the city outside. Kingsbury stared at Milbank, his face a mixture of shock and fury. Finally he grabbed his coat and stormed out without another word. Milbank sighed and sank back into his chair. This wasn't how he wanted it to end, but he knew it had to be done. The fund couldn't afford to become a target. Not now. Not ever. The Rockefeller empire wasn't built on ideals. It was built on power, precision, and the ability to adapt. Kingsbury was a visionary, but visionaries had a way of burning too bright. Milbank had extinguished the flame, but the machinery of influence kept turning, as relentless and unstoppable as ever. Meanwhile, the Rockefeller Foundation's investments in medical research were yielding dividends. Laboratories funded by the foundation were making breakthroughs in antibiotics and vaccines. But these advances came with a price: the dominance of synthetic drugs over natural remedies. The pharmaceutical companies were quick to capitalize. With Rockefeller's backing, they launched marketing campaigns that positioned their products as modern miracles. Doctors, trained in Rockefeller-funded schools, prescribed the drugs without question. Patients, trusting their physicians, accepted the treatments as the best medicine science could offer. The machinery of influence extended to the media. Popular magazines and newspapers ran glowing stories about the wonders of modern medicine, often written by journalists with ties to Rockefeller-backed institutions. Public service announcements, sponsored by the Milbank Fund, urged citizens to trust science and follow their doctor's advice. The result was a society deeply embedded in a pharmaceutical paradigm. Alternative approaches were dismissed as outdated or unscientific. The idea that health could be achieved through diet, exercise, and natural remedies was relegated to the fringes of medical thought. But not everyone was convinced. A small but vocal group of critics began to question the system. They pointed to the growing influence of corporations in medicine, the conflicts of interest within research institutions, and the suppression of alternative therapies.
So this isn't about health.
One critic wrote in a letter to the editor of a prominent medical journal.
This isn't about health, it's about profit. The Rockefellers don't care about curing disease, they care about controlling the market.
The criticism didn't go unnoticed. Rockefeller's advisors recognized the need to address the growing dissent. They launched a counter-campaign, funding studies that reinforced the legitimacy of mainstream medicine and discredited alternative approaches. Public relations firms were hired to manage the narrative, ensuring that the critics were portrayed as fringe elements. For every dissenting voice, there were 10 more singing the praises of Rockefeller-funded initiatives. The machinery of influence was relentless, and it showed no signs of slowing down. Chapter 4. The Council of Power. In June 1946, a closed-door meeting took place at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City called the International Health Conference. The attendees included some of the most powerful representatives from 61 nations, business magnates, university presidents, and government officials. At the head of the table sat David Rockefeller, the youngest of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s sons and the future face of the family dynasty.
Gentlemen,
David began, his voice calm but authoritative.
our influence has grown beyond even my grandfather's wildest dreams, but we cannot afford to rest on our laurels. The world is changing, and we must change with it.
The meeting's agenda was ambitious. The Rockefellers were planning their next move, a global network of influence that would extend their reach far beyond America. Education and medicine had been their proving grounds. Now, they aimed to shape international policy. Central to this plan was the creation of the World Health Organization. Officially, the WHO was a United Nations agency dedicated to improving global health. Unofficially, it was a vehicle for Rockefeller interests. The Rockefeller Foundation played a key role in the WHO's establishment, providing funding and technical expertise. They placed their allies in key positions, ensuring that the organization's priorities aligned with their own. Public health campaigns focused on vaccines and pharmaceuticals, often at the expense of broader issues like sanitation and nutrition. At the same time, the Rockefellers were investing heavily in international development. Through organizations like the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment, they funded projects in agriculture, education, and infrastructure. But these initiatives weren't purely altruistic. They were also designed to create new markets for American goods and services, further entrenching the Rockefeller empire. The meeting at the Waldorf Astoria concluded with a clear mandate. The Rockefellers would continue to expand their influence, but they would do so subtly, avoiding the spotlight. Their power would be felt, not seen, their legacy written in the policies and institutions they shaped. As the attendees filed out of the room, David Rockefeller lingered, deep in thought. The challenges ahead were formidable, but he was confident. The machinery his family had built was unstoppable, a testament to the power of vision and determination.
We're not just shaping the world.
He murmured to himself.
We're defining it.
Chapter 5. The post-war order. The conference room on the 56th floor of Rockefeller Center was quiet, save for the steady hum of New York City below. A faint scent of leather and cigar smoke hung in the air, remnants of previous gatherings that had shaped industries, governments, and now a post-war world order. John D. Rockefeller III adjusted his tie, his piercing gaze scanning the faces of his advisors seated around the long mahogany table. The room exuded power, and the men present knew they were at the helm of something much larger than themselves.
The post-war world is ours to mold,
John began, his voice measured but resolute.
but we must tread carefully. We're not building an empire. Influence, not dominance, will be our currency.
Influence through what exactly?
An advisor inquired, leaning forward.
Philanthropy? Business? Politics? John's lips curled into a faint smile.
All of the above. The key is subtlety, making our presence indispensable without drawing unnecessary scrutiny.
The Rockefellers had already started laying the groundwork. The United Nations headquarters stood as a testament to their vision, constructed on land donated by the family. It was a symbolic gesture, one that positioned them as stewards of global peace and cooperation. Yet beneath the veneer of altruism lay a calculated strategy to embed their values into the emerging international order.
Gentlemen, the United Nations is not just a building. It is a framework, a gateway, Through it, we influence policies, shape global priorities, and most importantly, align them with our vision.
A ripple of nods spread around the table. The Marshall Plan, with its billions of dollars flowing into war-torn Europe, presented the perfect opportunity. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, ERP, was a US-led initiative aimed at providing financial aid to Western European countries after World War II to help rebuild their economies and prevent the spread of communism. Proposed by US Secretary of State George C. Marshall in a speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, the plan became a cornerstone of post-war recovery efforts. While publicly framed as an act of American generosity, it also paved the way for Rockefeller-backed industries to dominate markets overseas. Steel, oil, and pharmaceuticals, these sectors thrived under contracts and policies steered by their influence. In Geneva, the World Health Organization, WHO, was taking shape. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller money played a pivotal role in defining its agenda. The eradication of diseases like malaria and smallpox was a noble cause, but it also ensured that Rockefeller-funded pharmaceutical companies became indispensable partners in these efforts.
We're writing history.
One advisor remarked, lighting a cigarette.
And making a tidy profit while we're at it.
Not all endeavors were met with unanimous approval. Latin America, rife with populist movements, proved a thorn in their side. Leaders like Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala and Juan Perón in Argentina railed against US imperialism, tying it directly to corporate interests. Rockefeller-backed initiatives, including the operations of United Fruit Company, were accused of exploiting local populations and resources. The United Fruit Company, UFC, was a powerful US-based corporation that dominated the banana trade in Central and South America during much of the 20th century. Established in 1899, the company controlled vast agricultural lands, transportation networks, and political influence in many Latin American countries, which were often referred to as banana republics due to their economic dependence on banana exports.
Arbenz is a problem.
One advisor warned during a heated discussion.
His land reforms are threatening our assets in Guatemala.
John's expression darkened.
The problem will be dealt with.
He replied curtly. And it was. In came the CIA. Known as Operation PB Success, the CIA's 1954 coup d'etat in Guatemala was a covert operation orchestrated by the United States to overthrow the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. It left an indelible mark, reinforcing perceptions of the Rockefellers' reach into the darkest corners of US intelligence. The coup marked a significant event in Cold War history and had lasting consequences for Guatemala and US-Latin American relations. As the decade came to a close, the family's influence was firmly entrenched across the globe. Yet the looming shadow of the Cold War presented a new challenge. To maintain their grip, they would need to adapt and innovate. Chapter 6. The Seeds of Resistance. The whispers of dissent grew louder as the mid-20th century progressed. A growing number of doctors, scientists, and journalists began questioning the dominance of the Rockefeller-backed medical-industrial complex. These critics formed alliances, sharing stories of suppressed research and silenced voices. Dr. Linus Pauling, a two-time Nobel laureate, was one such voice. Pauling's research into the benefits of high-dose vitamin C challenged the pharmaceutical paradigm. His studies showed promising results in boosting immunity and even combating cancer. But his findings were met with skepticism, not because they lacked merit, but because they threatened the status quo. The AMA and other Rockefeller-influenced organizations dismissed Pauling's work as pseudoscience. Media outlets, many of which relied on advertising dollars from pharmaceutical companies, ran hit pieces questioning his credibility. Pauling, once celebrated for his brilliance, found himself marginalized. But Pauling wasn't alone. A network of alternative health practitioners and researchers began to form. They shared a common belief that health was about more than just drugs and procedures. They advocated for nutrition, exercise, and holistic care, and they saw the Rockefeller empire as a barrier to true progress. In 1963, a pivotal moment occurred. the Milbank Fund released a report praising the benefits of community health centers. These centers, which provided holistic care, were gaining traction in underserved areas, but the report's recommendations clashed with the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller advisors worked to ensure that federal funding for these centers was limited. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was the Rockefeller-backed establishment with its vast resources and institutional power. On the other were the dissidents, armed with little more than their convictions and a growing base of public support. Chapter 7. The global stage. David Rockefeller's vision extended far beyond the borders of the United States. By the 1970s, the Rockefeller Foundation was deeply involved in international development. Their initiatives spanned continents, from agricultural projects in Africa to health campaigns in Asia. One of their most ambitious efforts was the Green Revolution. Led by Norman Borlaug, a Rockefeller-funded scientist, the initiative aimed to combat global hunger through high-yield crops and modern farming techniques. The program was hailed as a success, saving millions from starvation. But it also came with consequences. Critics argued that the Green Revolution's reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, products often supplied by Rockefeller-linked companies, created new problems. Soil degradation, water scarcity, and economic dependency plagued the regions it was meant to help. Small farmers struggled to compete, their livelihoods overshadowed by corporate agriculture. At the same time, the Rockefeller Foundation's involvement in global health initiatives continued to grow. They funded vaccine research, disease eradication campaigns, and public health education. But their efforts weren't without controversy. In India, a Rockefeller-backed sterilization program aimed at controlling population growth faced backlash. Reports emerged of coercion and human rights abuses. The program's failures highlighted the tension between philanthropic ambition and ethical responsibility. David Rockefeller defended the foundation's work.
Our goal has always been to improve lives,
He said in an interview.
but progress is never without challenges. We learn, we adapt, and we move forward.
But despite his confident tone, he thought to himself,
There must be a way to silence those opposed to our progress.
The sun was setting over the Hudson Valley estate when David Rockefeller called the family meeting to order. The 1960s had ushered in an era of both turmoil and opportunity, and David, as the family's de facto head, knew they were at a crossroads.
The world is changing. Oil remains our lifeblood, but the rise of OPEC cannot be ignored. Resource-rich nations are asserting their independence. We must be ready to adapt.
Chase Manhattan Bank, under David's leadership, had already begun forging relationships with key players in the Middle East. His frequent trips to meet with the Shah of Iran and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia were well documented, though the true nature of these discussions often remained behind closed doors.
King Faisal's nervous about Western exploitation. He wants guarantees.
We offer him stability, investments in infrastructure, education. We make them dependent on our expertise, not just our oil.
Meanwhile, a different kind of storm was brewing. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a book that eloquently challenged humanity's unwavering faith in technological progress by exposing the dangers of the pesticide DDT, had ignited a firestorm of environmental activism. The family, synonymous with oil, found itself in a precarious position.
We can't afford to be the villains of this narrative. If we're smart, we'll lead the charge for change.
The Rockefeller Foundation began funneling funds into environmental research and conservation projects. They supported the establishment of national parks and bankrolled studies into renewable energy. Publicly, they were hailed as visionaries. Privately, some advisors grumbled about greenwashing, a calculated effort to safeguard the family's reputation.
It's not greenwashing, it's insurance against irrelevance.
By the decade's end, the strategy was paying dividends. The Rockefellers were no longer merely captains of industry. They were architects of a sustainable future. Critics remained skeptical, questioning whether their environmental initiatives were genuine or merely another form of control. Chapter 9. The shift. By the 1980s, the world was shifting yet again. Silicon Valley was rising, and the digital revolution threatened to upend traditional industries. The Rockefellers' strongholds in energy, finance, and medicine seemed almost archaic in comparison to the promise of technology.
Information is the new oil. The question is, how do we position ourselves?
David proclaimed during a board meeting. The family began investing heavily in emerging technologies. Partnerships with institutions like MIT and Stanford, both of which had long-standing Rockefeller ties, accelerated research into artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and telecommunications. At the same time, the Rockefeller Foundation expanded its global health initiatives. The HIV/AIDS epidemic galvanized their efforts, leading to significant investments in anti-retroviral drugs and prevention campaigns. Their role in shaping global health policy grew, though not without controversy.
You're turning health into a commodity.
A journalist accused David during a rare interview.
How do you respond to critics who say you're profiting from suffering?
David's expression remained impassive.
Progress requires investment. We're providing solutions, not creating problems.
As the millennium approached, the Rockefellers had successfully navigated yet another transformation. Yet the digital age brought new players to the forefront, challenging their dominance. Would the family's legacy endure, or would they be relegated to the sidelines of history? Or worse, would they be thought of as puppeteers, using civilization as pawns under their control? The answer, as always, lay in their ability to adapt. Chapter 10. The Dawn of the Information Age. The conference room at 30 Rockefeller Plaza was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight. David Rockefeller sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands steepled, eyes focused on the array of advisors, strategists, and media consultants gathered before him. The year was 1983, and the air was thick with urgency.
The world is changing faster than we can comprehend. The way people consume information, the way they think, the way they act. We're no longer just fighting battles in boardrooms or across supply chains. This war will be fought in living rooms, through television sets, newspapers, and soon enough, computer screens.
An advisor, a grizzled veteran of corporate media, nodded.
Cable news is exploding. CNN is already making waves with their 24-hour news cycle. The narrative will no longer be controlled by the morning edition of The Times or the evening news on ABC.
Then we ensure that we're the ones shaping that narrative.
The Rockefeller family had always understood the power of influence. But while the rise of mass media threatened this power, it also presented an unprecedented opportunity. For decades, their wealth and connections had bought them access to editors, publishers, and broadcasters. Now, with the advent of cable television and the looming potential of the internet, the battlefield was expanding exponentially.
We've already made significant investments in NBC, but we should think bigger, diversify, control multiple streams of information. Not just news, but entertainment, publishing, and
education. That's where real influence lies. What people read in textbooks, what they're taught in schools, ideas planted early grow deep roots.
The table murmured in agreement. One younger strategist, barely in his 30s but already carrying the swagger of someone who had earned his seat, spoke up.
We need to be subtle about it, though. The public is becoming more skeptical of concentrated power. If we're too overt, it'll backfire. Look at what's happening with the Trilateral Commission.
David's eyes narrowed. The Trilateral Commission, a think tank he had helped found to foster cooperation among North America, Europe, and Japan, had become a lightning rod for conspiracy theories. To many, it epitomized the notion of a shadowy elite pulling the strings of global governance.
Let them talk. Conspiracies are distractions. What matters is what's real. Control the information, and you control reality.
Chapter 11, Subtlety. Always subtlety. By the mid-1980s, the Rockefellers had positioned themselves at the nexus of media and technology. Their investments in NBC, funneled through GE to conceal their influence, provided a foothold in the burgeoning cable news market. Simultaneously, they funneled money into academic institutions and think tanks, ensuring their influence extended into research and policy.
We need more than just ownership. We need partnerships with journalists, producers, and academics. People who understand the power of storytelling.
The family's philanthropy became a key tool in this effort. Grants flowed to universities, public broadcasting initiatives, and cultural organizations. Publicly, these donations were framed as acts of benevolence. Privately, they were strategic investments.
A grant to PBS buys more goodwill than a full-page ad in the New York Times. It's not just about visibility, it's about trust.
But even as they expanded their media empire, the Rockefellers were not immune to the challenges of the digital revolution. By the early 1990s, the internet was no longer a fringe experiment. It was rapidly becoming a mainstream phenomenon.
We're entering uncharted territory. The internet is decentralizing information. Anyone with a computer can publish a story, share an idea, or spread a lie. How do we maintain influence in a world like that?
A young advisor, fresh from Stanford, chimed in.
We adapt. The internet isn't just a threat, it's an opportunity. Social networks, search engines, e-commerce, these are the new gatekeepers. If we invest wisely, we can shape this ecosystem from the ground up.
Then we'll invest. But remember, subtlety. Always subtlety.
Chapter 12, The Digital Age. By the late 1990s, Rockefeller-funded initiatives were quietly shaping the digital age. Through partnerships with universities and venture capital firms, they backed early internet ventures and emerging technologies. At the same time, their philanthropy shifted to include digital literacy programs and online education platforms.
The narrative is evolving. People trust what they see online more than what they read in a newspaper. We need to meet them where they are.
One of their most significant moves was their involvement in the development of the World Wide Web's infrastructure. While their name rarely appeared in public discussions, their money was there, funding research into data encryption, server technologies, and even early search engines.
The beauty of this is that the internet democratizes information, but even democracies need architects.
Not everyone was convinced. Critics accused the family of trying to co-opt the very tools that were meant to dismantle traditional power structures.
They're just dressing up control as progress. The Rockefellers are building the infrastructure of the future, but make no mistake, they'll own it.
Said one journalist in an expose that ran in a minor outlet.
The Rockefellers are building the infrastructure of the future, but make no mistake, they'll own it.
David, reading the piece in his office, chuckled softly.
They think they've caught us, but all they've done is prove our point. Information is power.
Conclusion. The game. As the new millennium dawned, the Rockefeller family had once again adapted to the shifting sands of history. Their investments in media, education, and technology ensured that their influence remained pervasive, even as the world changed around them.
This isn't just about preserving a legacy, it's about shaping the future, not just for us, but for everyone. The question is whether they'll see it that way.
And so, as the internet reshaped society and the 24-hour news cycle became the norm, the Rockefellers remained at the center of the story, not always in the spotlight, but always in the room, always pulling the strings. As David looked out over the New York skyline one last time, he couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. The world had changed, but the game remained the same. And the Rockefellers, as always, were playing to win. You just don't know they're playing.